We would like to welcome participants into the webinar room. We will be starting the discussion momentarily. Thank you very much for your patience. Excellencies, distinguished moderators, speakers, and guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from Jakarta. Welcome back to another session of the ASEAN Institute for Peace and Reconciliation Discussion Series 2022. This afternoon session will take up the theme, Pooling Expertise for Regional Conflict Resolution Best Practices. First of all, let me start by conveying our gratitude and appreciation to the Embassy of Ireland and the Embassy of Finland in Jakarta for the continued generous support to these discussion series. This program continues to be one of the high visibility and highly engaging initiative of the Institute, enabling us to cover a wide range of topics, but also building linkage and network with various organizations, institutions, and individuals all over the world. Today's topic happens to be in line with one of the functions of our Institute, which is creating pool of expertise and provide support for ASEAN bodies. Now, ASEAN IPR already has one pool of experts, which is the ASEAN Women for Peace Registry, or AWPR, established in 2018, which is in support of the 2017 Joint Statement on Advancing Women, Peace, and Security in ASEAN. But other than the AWPR, the ASEAN IPR is also looking at the possibility of establishing another pool of expertise. This is what we plan to call the ASEAN Panel of the Wise. But obviously, this region is not the first one to utilize such mechanism for mediation and conflict resolution. And for this purpose, we would like to learn from other regions with similar experiences as well. Now, before we start, as usual, I would like to request a group photo involving the moderator and all the speakers, as well as the executive director of the ASEAN IPR. I'll just switch off my camera for now, and I will start countdown. I seek the assistance of our ASEAN IPR secretary colleagues to take the picture. In 1, 2, 3. Okay, another big smile. 1, 2, 3. And then once more for luck. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists, I ask your indulgence once more for me to relay some house rules to ensure everybody's comfort in following the discussion. Today's discussion will be around 2.5 hours long. The event is simultaneously live streamed on the ASEAN IPR YouTube channel. Please ensure that you have steady internet connection and the updated version of the Zoom software. During presentation from the speakers, we kindly ask that attendees in Zoom who wish to pose a question to the speakers, please use the Q&A box. While viewers on YouTube can use the live chat box to pose your questions. Please follow the format as explained by the organizers in the respective chat boxes. We ask that you refrain from using the chat or message box function for personal or extensive discussions. We understand that some participants are eager to get their e-certificates. However, the link to the e-certificate will only be provided at the end of the event. We ask that all participants are polite and considerate in your messages, and please respect this house rule so that we can follow the discussion comfortably. Thank you very much. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Ms. Iza Khairinia Ibrahim. Ms. Iza is an analyst with the Foreign Policy and Security Studies FPSS program. She graduated from the Australian National University with an MA in Strategic Studies. She also completed her double degree at ANU with a BA in International Relations and a Bachelor of Asia Pacific Studies. Her research areas are in foreign policy and security developments in the Pacific, including ongoing developments in Thailand and Philippines, and non-traditional security developments in Southeast Asia. Her research interests also include nuclear politics, civil-military relations, the applications of diplomacy, and Malaysia's foreign and defense policies. She is also part of the Secretariat for the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific, or CSCAP. Ms. Iza, I entrust the discussion over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kartika. Good day or good evening to everyone tuning in today. As introduced, I will be the moderator for the session. And today we'll be joined by 4 very esteemed panelists that will share their knowledge and experiences, all relating to mitigating, managing, and resolving conflict, all based on their experiences from their respective regions through their work and participation of regional actors and mechanisms. And our first speaker would be Dr. Olli Rohomaki. He is currently the senior advisor with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Finland. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and with an extensive amount of experience in diplomacy, research, and practice. Dr. Rohomaki, I introduce you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and good morning from Helsinki. It's 10 a.m. and it's a bit drizzly and cloudy, and I wish I was in Jakarta or the Asian region with better weather. I was just a couple of weeks ago actually in Thailand and Myanmar and enjoyed the climate much more. Anyway, let me say a few words on Finnish approaches to peace mediation. I would like to sort of set the scene and begin with a quote from the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He said recently that war is increasingly becoming more complex, and so is mediating peace. I think in that short line, he captured quite well the current mood that we're facing today in the world. My presentation, I'd just like to sort of 3 points. Say a few words on Finnish policies on peace mediation, then ways of our working, our modus operandi, and then a few words on artificial intelligence and peace mediation, something that Finland is quite good on the technology part. So first on our government program on peace mediation. In Finland's foreign policy, we do place quite a strong priority on conflict prevention, mediation, peace building, and our measures include we participate a lot and strongly with the United Nations mediation and dialogue processes, and in other similar processes. I myself have served with the United Nations for quite a few years in the past. And we place, as a government, as a state, we work a lot with civil society and with non-governmental organizations, and particularly, of course, with Finnish mediation providers. One of which is quite famous, called the Crisis Management Initiative, that was set up by our former president Martti Ahtisaari, and who was working at the Aceh peace process some time ago. In line with the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security, Finland promotes women's participation in peace talks and peace building, with an emphasis of safeguarding women's and girls' rights in peace processes. Because I think there's a lot of research and hard data on the fact that peace cannot be built. A sustainable peace cannot be built on structures that maintain inequality. So hence the 1325 theme is very important for us. Also, Finland supports activities related to youth, peace and security theme. And just 1 year ago, Finland published a national action plan, the Finnish action plan on how to implement the UN resolution 2250 that is on youth, peace and security themes. Basically, the way we see our foreign policy, and this is linked, peace mediation is linked to Finnish foreign and security policy objectives, is that promoting lasting peace and stable societal development serves us ourselves, that is Finland, and of course, as we're part of the European Union, European interests also worldwide. And our long-term efforts have been taken to develop particularly Finnish mediation competence and the conflict prevention and resolution capacity, diplomatic conflict prevention, diplomatic peace mediation capacity within our own foreign service. And Finland responds to the international interests in the Finnish competence by providing expertise or basically good services. And to strengthen Finnish national mediation competence and capacity, we set up within the political department a Center for Peace Mediation about 1.5 years ago. So basically bringing a sort of a center of excellence within the foreign service itself to concentrate on peace mediation issues. And the way we work basically, and this has links to our peace mediation policies, is that we also, besides working with Finnish actors within the foreign service itself and then Finnish non-governmental organizations, we work strongly with other international organizations, including the United Nations. We have quite a few Finnish experts in the UN peace, the UN mediation support unit in New York, and also within the Organization of Security and Cooperation of Europe, OSCE. And then we have been working for quite a long time, over a decade now, with our African Union colleagues, building supporting the building of capacity of the African Union peace mediation. And of course, since we're a member state of the European Union, we promote a comprehensive role for the EU in mediation and conflict prevention. And like I mentioned previously, we focus a lot on civil society actors, and also, for example, we take into account the religious actors in different fields who support our peace mediation work. And networking and partnerships with key actors is something that we have been working on both nationally and internationally. And something that is sort of quite new is the fact that we have peace building, humanitarian aid, and development cooperation. They form measures that are known as the triple nexus. So in the past, there was a lot of emphasis on how to make the transition from humanitarian aid to development cooperation smooth. But in recent years, building peace mediation into the equation is a new challenge that actually all the international actors involved in the field are struggling with, and this is something that we have also been working on. That is the triple nexus. And some of the modus operandi that we are involved in is that we are, peace mediation, we have track 1, track 2, and track 3 work. So of course, as you know very well, track 1 is the official state-to-state processes where we can act as a mediator or participate in formal negotiations. And then track 2 is something that that we support informal confidence building measures between conflict parties by providing good offices and being a safe venue to conduct dialogues. And then track 3 is also very important, to support unofficial different national dialogues. Finland, we have been now supporting biannually national dialogue conference in Helsinki, bringing different actors from different parts of the world together to work on national dialogues. And here, the role of traditional religious leaders and local initiatives are very important. So for us, even we're a state, working hand in hand with civil society is really, really important. And in fact, I am of the opinion, based on my own experience, is that track 2, track 3 processes are becoming more and more important. We see less and less sort of track 1 initiatives, that is, states between states. That is not to say that they are not important, but we see more initiatives on the track 2 and track 3 processes. And then finally, just a few words on new technologies and artificial intelligence, sort of a deep dive into this. Artificial intelligence is relevant to mediators and conflict resolutions experts in 3 ways. Artificial intelligence alters the way wars are waged in profound and still largely unknown ways, and thus the dynamics between conflict and warring parties shift constantly. Artificial intelligence can be a useful tool for mediators, peace mediation support actors, and conflict resolution experts. And artificial intelligence is increasingly important as a topic in international and national policy debates, with various security and defense policy implications that is connected to artificial intelligence. And hence it is important that peace mediators, they need to have a good awareness and an understanding of the key current developments in the field. So, in September 21, that is about a year ago, the United Nations Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, called for a moratorium on the use of artificial intelligence where it poses human rights risks, for example, facial scanning. And the European Union is working to regulate artificial intelligence, both within the Union, but also, to advance the principles, global principles of the use of artificial intelligence. Key tech companies such as Microsoft are also advancing the debate around the risks of artificial intelligence. And Finland has been and is working in the front line of this debate across sectors. Actually, more than 2,000 Finnish organizations currently apply some form of artificial technology. And the Finnish government talks about the 4th industrial revolution, which encompasses artificial intelligence, machine learning, 5G, 6G, Internet of the Things, virtual reality, quantum computation, big data, among others. And this year we have been chairing the Freedom Online Coalition of 32 member states with artificial intelligence in the focus. And artificial intelligence is also very important for our own national development. And in 2020, there was a report that came out that was titled State of Artificial Intelligence in Finland. And Finnish educational institutions, including the famous Aalto University and University of Helsinki, have engaged global audiences through their popular artificial intelligence courses and events.
Sorry to cut in. You have 2 minutes left.
Okay. So just finally, 2 points. Artificial intelligence and big data are very often used to manipulate political debates and social dynamics through social media. And I have seen this actually in the case of Myanmar. And it really has often dangerous real-world implications. So hence, as a tool, artificial intelligence can be useful to strengthen peace processes in terms of using the data analysis for warning and forecasting, scenario and process analysis, but it is really a tool that is a double-edged sword. It has both possibilities for building confidence, but it can be used to manipulate the scene. So I think these were basically some of the points that I wanted to raise from our side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rohomaki, for that very insightful introduction and also a very interesting coverage, especially on matters of AI, because I don't think this is something people generally talk about. We'll move on to our second speaker. We have Mr. Patrick de Vries. He's a diplomat from the Netherlands who started his career as a lawyer, defending the central government of the Netherlands, dealing in matters such as asylum and refugee cases, and being involved in developing these policies. And then after that, he's moved on to become a diplomat in the Dutch Foreign Service. And he's also focused in areas such as conflict mediation, working particularly as a senior advisor to the European Institute of Peace, leading a team on Afghanistan and advising on Middle Eastern conflicts. Mr. de Vries, I open the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning from The Hague, the Netherlands. Thank you for your kind introduction, and really grateful for the opportunity to participate in this interesting and important exchange. Of course, I am very pleased to contribute, but very much also hope to learn from this discussion. And I really hope that I will stick to the timeline. Maybe before going into the topic of regional conflict resolution, I like to take one step back and say a couple of things about more, let's say, the context, peace and global order, and the context we find ourselves in at this moment. First of all, speaking about peace, one has to define this, and for me, it is not just the absence of armed violence, but it is the broader interpretation. It means a sense of safety, job prospect, access to basic services, justice, equality, and in that perspective, unfortunately, we have to conclude that large parts of the world are increasingly not peaceful. The Global Peace Index indicates that peace is in sharp decline, and I don't want to bore you too much with numbers, but it sometimes helps for context. The cost of violence to the global economy was 11% of global GDP in 2021. And the numbers of countries experiencing violent internal conflict rose from 29 to 38 in the past 2 decades. And the number of people around the world forcibly displaced due to conflict increased from 31 million to over 88 million between 2008 and 22. And I think the overarching issue here is that the global order is changing before our eyes. Rivalries, geopolitical rivalries, that deepen the divide between East and West, North and South. And we also see this play out in the context of Ukraine. Tensions that increase also in the neighborhood of Europe, in the Caucasus, in the Balkans, changes in engagements, European engagement, disengaging from Afghanistan, significantly stepping up its relations with the Gulf in the Middle East. So related to geopolitical tension. So the question here is, in that wider context, is there a way towards a more benign order, and how can Europe and other regions, of course, contribute to such an order where powerful actors maybe compete in some areas, but cooperate in others, and observe more flexible rules for preventing conflict, and importantly also allowing open economies to flourish. Well, it's tempting to go deeper into the geoeconomics and geopolitics, but I like to share here a practitioner's view on the state of conflict management, conflict resolution, and how conflict resolution as one of the tools to foster peace can better contribute to managing conflict. Because clearly there is a need and scope for conflict resolution, and that need is going up. But we face various challenges that I like to highlight. And there is among practitioners, I think, a wide agreement that the traditional model for dispute resolution is no longer viable. We see very limited resourcing for mediation and conflict resolution. From various resources, we see that 5,000 times more spending is allocated on the military than on mediation. And there's often only short-term funding for conflict resolution and mediation. There is an overemphasis on agreements before actually restoring relationships. We see that agreements often do not last because we neglect the element of implementation of deals. We see often political appointments for peace envoys and not always experts with a long history in conflict mediation. And of course, there is the political element of a lack of political will in mediating. And an internationalization of conflict, where international actors support certain groups in conflict. So my point is we need to adapt to this new environment in a different geopolitical setting and different and much more complex conflicts. And in that regard, I like to raise for your consideration while thinking about how to possibly adapt 3 points. One is on norms, the other one is on new actors and much more active actors, and sort of innovative ideas related maybe also to the artificial intelligence point that was just alluded to. But first, norms. What we see is that peacemaking through the multilateral system depends a lot on the traditional model, which is focused on exercising influence through states and multilateral organizations. And this model is predominantly embedded in Western liberal values to support good governance and democratic transition processes. But what is important is that there is increasingly powerful actors that do not always adhere to the same principles embedded in this system. But these actors can still be very useful in addressing some of the world's many conflicts. And we see as practitioners that we're sometimes struggling with these norms. Western value-based interventions are often viewed as acts of self-interest and double standards. Why was regime change in Iraq or Afghanistan legitimate, and why is it not in other places? So an important element here is to better understand perceptions around our actions. And for mediators, that it is maybe also time to talk a bit less about models or norms that could be applied a decade ago, but instead look more realistically at what we need to get the work done. Secondly, actors. The last 2 decades, I think, have witnessed the rise of new actors that are much more active in the field of conflict mediation. At the global scale, obvious one is China. Beijing has increased significantly its focus on conflict prevention, mediating not only in the Asia region, but also in regions like Africa. Second largest contributor to peacekeeping operation. But there are other actors as well at that global level, Brazil, India, South Africa. And what we see is regional actors. We see Qatar playing a role in Afghanistan, Algeria in Mali, Mexico and Venezuela, Turkey in Northern Africa, now also in Ukraine. So the question is also, how can we sort of turn that expansion of actors in the field of mediation into an advantage? And I think, first of all, of course, we need to better understand how each of these regional actors work, tactics, strategies, because it would require a sort of rebalancing of relationships in that multilateral system. And the point in this regard is that with the current traditional model not always being applicable in this new context, that working with also, let's say, non-traditional partners from a Western point of view across the world, from Asia to the global South, is needed to basically also develop new models of mediation. And in developing new models, my third point, there's a couple of ideas I like to highlight, elements that could be taken into account in sort of developing those. First of all, I think we often fail to take account of the roles of business actors, economy in conflict resolution. While we know that business and economic actors are critical to prospects of peaceful recovery, they hardly feature in peace agreements. Often also peace agreements unravel because there is no economic incentive. And it seems that mediators need to better understand power relations, the economic infrastructure, and the incentives that drive business actors. Secondly, I would like to highlight that very often mediators are under huge pressure, and that is that there's too much expectation in too little time to advance mediation, and this really neglects the importance of relationships, the trust building among parties, but also the psychological dimension of conflict is often overlooked. The underlying emotions, psychology and behavior science is often missing in high level practice, but it is a way to better understand why conflicts are created in the first place, how to get to different perspectives and new relationships in a conflict setting. Lastly, some more specific elements. I think investments in digital engagement is crucial to create conditions for mediation. We see that through digitalization, involvement of the wider public is really changing. Currently, demonstrations in Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, you see an increased involvement of people who want to voice their opinion on conflict situations. And there's much more to explore in that regard. Environmental security is a field, environmental security and peace, which will be increasingly interconnected, something we need to focus on. And lastly, more focus on inclusion. And that doesn't only mean, let's say, topics like women inclusion, which of course is crucial. And it's not only an inclusive process, but also inclusive outcomes in mediation that require much more attention. I think these are sort of key points that I wanted to highlight. I mean, in many places, good work on mediation and dialogue is helping to prevent, resolve conflict. But in this changing context, innovative ideas and an open mind to new models, not only relying on the traditional models from the past, is required. And I hope we can have a discussion on this. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. De Vries. It was a very good highlight, especially because I think for a lot of peace and conflict resolution, a lot of this, sometimes people tend to get lost in the big picture or the ideation of things. And it's sometimes really important to kind of remind people that we sometimes have to accept being pragmatic as a priority. And now we will introduce our third speaker, Mr. Itonde Kakoma. He is currently the IFRC Head of Delegation and Permanent Representative to the African Union and international organizations. And in this capacity, he has served and advanced continental-wide humanitarian diplomacy initiatives for the African Union in public health security, climate change, disaster risk management, and humanitarian affairs. And I think another really interesting highlight in his very illustrious career was that he was an international observer for the national referendum on the right to self-determination for the people of South Sudan in 2011. And he served as an advisor and report writer for the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Over to you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. It is good to be with you, and deep appreciation to Ambassador Pujab and colleagues at the ASEAN Institute for Peace and Reconciliation for this invitation. I will frame my intervention really from the point of a personal experience, as if I understood from the introduction and the background note, the aim and ambition to establish a panel of the wise for the ASEAN region, as well as other types of rosters that have been put in place. So I'll share a bit of my own personal reflections, having worked with other regions on such matters. Having said that, and I must highlight in this context, really I'm not here as IFRC's permanent representative to the African Union, while that is my official capacity. It is more so with regards to nearly 2 decades long experience in peace mediation with prominent independent institutions, not least of which being CMI, Marty Atazari Peace Foundation, lastly serving as Director for Global Strategy, and also as Assistant Director at the Carter Center for Conflict Resolution prior to CMI. And in that spirit, I would highlight a few lessons for consideration as we think about this together. And these lessons are drawn from having worked alongside prominent individuals who we could categorize as wise in their respective regions, former heads of state, as well as other prominent officials. And these lessons with regards to peace mediation are as follows. Number one, on values. This has come up a bit in the interventions prior to. Number two is with regards to cooperation. Number three is with regards to preparation. And finally, on trust. In short, on values, we could speak about it from the individual perspective of former President Marty Atazari, or former President Carter, or former President Benjamin Mkapa of Tanzania, with whom I worked, supported his efforts in the context of Great Lakes peace mediation. But when we speak of values from this perspective of regional organizations, I think they are enshrined very much so in not only regional specificity, culture, but the strong reference to mandate vis-a-vis the principle of subsidiarity. And we can talk about the extents and limitations of how the principle of subsidiarity plays out in the context of peace mediation, but this is at the center of the kinds of values that are brought to the table when a regional institution embarks, and thus a panel of the wise. Now, when we speak of cooperation, here I dare quote one of the leaders and distinguished peace leaders I referenced earlier and founder of CMI, former President Atazari. He spoke of his role as not being able to do, and excuse my English, a damn thing alone, meaning cooperation matters. And as good as an individual or as wise as a panel may be, to embed that regional expertise within the confluence of sub-regional, national, and international actors becomes absolutely essential, because it's not just about a principle of cooperation, it's also the reality, as our previous colleagues indicated, of the changing landscape of how peace and security exists. And there, I think ensuring that the mandate is strong and supported by all of the various actors is crucial for the validity of that mandate. Further to this, the preparation. Now, another anecdote would be that a mediator or a wise person is only as good as their team is, and is only as good as the preparatory measures. And here, former President Tanzania, President Kapa, spoke very boldly about this. You know, he was a sitting head of state when the formal peace agreement on Burundi, for example, was brokered in terms of the CPA in Arusha. But his later role as facilitator in 2015, he ensured that his team embarked on numerous, more than 40 preparatory sessions in the course of less than a year, so that you're not taking your knowledge for granted, that deep contextual expertise. And finally, in terms of lessons, I would speak of trust. And trust here, not only with regards to, I mean, you can have as deep of a bench in terms of expertise, you can have as an illustrious of a panel of wise persons, men and women and youth, as you wish. But if there is a lack of trust in terms of what they bring, then all of that is for nothing. And the strength of the mandate, as determined by the region or the international community or the national setting, the quality of the individuals, the expertise, hinges on trust. Trust within and trust without, that is with the parties. Now, practically speaking, before we hear from our colleague to walk through in a more detailed version of what that looks like in the context of the AU, I would say that as you consider establishing these mechanisms, 100% contextual expertise is central. Hence, there is validity of establishing these rosters and these panels. And the relationships that are tied to that contextual expertise is also essential, which is linked back to trust. We should not take for granted the ethno-linguistic dimensions of expertise. And here the language comes into play, knowledge of nuances, be they national or at a communal level. And so all of these elements point to the validity of having that kind of regional roster and particular panels. But for all the reasons that previous speakers mentioned, the changing landscape of peace mediation and geopolitics, versatility of skill set is also essential. We know the basics in terms of process design expertise, facilitation skills, drafting abilities. These are areas that I've worked on personally. But we also know that in the changing landscape, we need other types of expertise as well, which are not new, but perhaps need to be highlighted. A deeper understanding, as Dr. Oli indicated, on new forms of warfare and technology, but also at the granular level on anthropology and history, as a lot of the conflicts we see are tied to this. Finally, I would say, while a roster or a panel can be particular, it can also be expansive. And so we know many rosters that are hundreds of individuals, and many, as valid and credible as they may be, will not be deployed. And that's okay, because part of being on a roster is a validation and an affirmation of the respective roles that these individuals have in their particular context. So it builds also their own credibility as inside mediators or whatever their roles may be. That is not to say we shouldn't ensure efficient resources for their deployment. Otherwise, what's the point? But it is to say it provides a strong validation of regional expertise. Having this in mind, many of the crises we face, while geopolitical and of a changing world order nature, they are also pointing to generational change. And so keeping in mind that a panel of wise should not be limited solely to those who have held high office, as good as this is, as valid as it is, because they bring that experience firsthand and can share peer-to-peer lessons. But because we're talking about generational change in many contexts, not least of which in Africa, but elsewhere as well, we should be sensitive that, in fact, some individuals, some stakeholders in a particular crisis may not be so inclined to hear from those who have been representing, let's say, those types of offices, precisely because it reflects an old world vision. Now, I would say that the strength of any panel is also tied to the strength of the secretariat that panel has. And this is a very fine segue to our colleague who will walk us through in this regard. And further to the team and secretariat, I dare quote founder of CMI again, Kofi Annan, described as the 20th century's most successful mediator. He said that the UN, having served in many mandates, is only as good as its member states enable it to be. In the context of peace mediation, it can be applied to elsewhere. And I think this anecdote applies also to regional organizations. That is to say, the effectiveness of any regional organization in the context of peace or in the work that I do now is subject to how the member states enable that mandate to flourish. Thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to exchanging more.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kakoma, for that very interesting coverage and list of points and qualities that we need to be looking for regarding this panel of the wise should regional organizations like ASEAN or any other similar bodies would like to proceed. We will now move on to our final speaker, Ms. Netsanet Alemu. She is a policy officer within the Mediation and Dialogue Division of the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security at the African Union Commission. Her role has included providing technical support to the members of the Panel of the Wise, as alluded earlier, supporting to the operationalization of the FemWise Africa Network and the development of policies related to preventative diplomacy and mediation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Isa. And it's a real pleasure to be here today amongst esteemed colleagues. And it's a special honor to follow my mentor, Itonde. If you can just give me a second, I'm going to share my screen. Host, it would be great if you could enable me to screen share.
I think it's enabled. You can try to screen share.
Thank you. Okay, I hope you can all see my screen. And thank you again for the opportunity. And I'm here to talk about the Panel of the Wise and its subsidiary mechanisms, which operates at the level of the African Union and is actually one of the preventive diplomacy tools that is deployed by the institution in order to prevent, manage, and resolve conflicts across the continent. Regions of the African continent with extensive experience in peace, security, and development. They are appointed by the AU Assembly of Heads of State and Government following the recommendation of the chairperson of the Commission. and they serve for a period of 3 years. As you can see here, I've tried to put together some of the former and current members of the panel of the wise, and this ties in well with what the preceding speakers have elaborated on, in that many of the initiatives that are being deployed across the continent or around the world in terms of mediation or preventive diplomacy tends to be done by former state persons. They have the clout, and they also have the necessary experience. Might not be mediation specific, but they have worked on negotiations and other related aspects or related activities very close to mediation. I think I would like to point out here Madam Phumzile Mlambo Msoga, former Deputy President of South Africa, who is currently actually engaged in the Ethiopian peace talks being held in South Africa. I think it would be interesting to, colleagues during this meeting have called upon like the shift in global dynamics in terms of conflicts and the peace and security landscape. And it would be important to call back in terms of the evolution, the institution, the continental organization that we call the African Union has undergone in the past 20, 30 years or so. Given the number of conflicts taking place across the continent in the 1990s, the loss of lives and livelihoods that impact
Ms. Netzanen, I think your presentation froze and we cannot hear you. Hi, sorry, you're still on mute. Could you perhaps repeat the last, and if you would like us to help you with your PowerPoint presentation, we can certainly do so.
Thank you so much. Sorry, the internet is not the best at the moment in Addis Ababa, when we have video gets overloaded, but I'll just continue if you don't mind. So the Constitutive Act clearly indicated a shift in the approach in how member states approached conflicts, in that they decided to move away from the principle of non-interference to that of interference when, in particular cases, that is crimes against humanity, atrocities, and war crimes. And they also provided a provision for themselves to set up an organ in order to enable them to do this task. And this is where the protocol for establishment of the Peace and Security Council came about, which led to the establishment of the PSC, as we call it, whose mandate mirrors that of the Peace and Security Council of the United Nations. And it is a standing decision-making organ for the prevention, management, and resolution of conflicts. Along the same document, they also established similar structures that would support the Peace and Security Council and its mandate that we collectively call the African Peace and Security Architecture. And this is where the Panel of the Wise is situated, working in a synergetic manner with the Continental Early Warning System that is used for data collection and analysis, with the AU Commission, which serves as the Secretariat of the AU, the Peace Fund, I don't think it needs further elaboration, and the African Standby Force, a standby contingent of forces to be deployed whenever the need arises. Those 5 we call critical pillars of the African Peace and Security Architecture is the new phase of the institutionalized approach to the prevention, management, and resolution of conflict. Now, the Panel of the Wise is not the only instrument at the disposal of the African Union to deploy its preventive diplomacy and peacemaking efforts. We have the Peace and Security Council, we have the special envoys and special representatives of the chairperson of the Commission, and of course we have the chairperson of the Commission and the chairperson of the Union that is not put in this image here. So although the PSC protocol, as we call it, provided the initial mandate for the Panel of the Wise, the substantive aspect of their mandate was delivered through the modalities for the functioning of the Panel of the Wise that was adopted in 2007 by the Peace and Security Council. Now, the panel, that's why I am hesitant to call it a pool of experts, because they have a very unique mandate that is not available to other pool of experts, I think, internationally, perhaps even not just at the continental level. And that is the ability to pronounce themselves on any issue related to peace, stability, and security. Yes, their primary mandate is to advise the PSC and the chairperson on issues related to peace and security, but then they don't need to wait for a member state consensus for them to bring up a sensitive issue to the forefront of African leaders. And this is one of the unique mandates that have not been utilized to the fullest, and which needs to be worked on continuously as we go on supporting the Panel of the Wise. In order to perform their functions of support to the PSC and the chairperson, they can assist and advise, of course, but through the establishment of channels of communication between conflicting parties. They can conduct fact-finding missions by talking to conflicting parties and belligerents and ensuring they have the necessary facts to take back to them to advise the PSC and the chairperson. And they can also encourage the initiation of political dialogue and other trust and confidence building measures. And this was exemplified in the panel's efforts in the Central African Republic that enabled that country to hold a national dialogue, I think, in 2016. Now, the first members of the Panel of the Wise were appointed in 2008, and now we are at 2022. And throughout the past almost 14 years, it has gone through various levels of institutionalization. You can see here a very simple organogram of what the Panel of the Wise is and who its subsidiary and what its subsidiary mechanisms are. And the AU Commission is here, which serves as the secretariat to the Panel of the Wise. So while it started off as 5 admin personalities in 2008, through time, it has expanded to include not just former members of the Panel of the Wise, but also various actors that operate at the national and sub-regional levels. And here we can see the establishment of the Group of Friends of the Panel of the Wise in 2011. These are former members of the Panel of the Wise. This allows their continued and sustained engagement in the works of subsequent panels. We have the Pan-African Network of the Wise, FemWise Africa, and Wise Youth, which I will elaborate on in the following slides. Now, we said that the Panel of the Wise has a very unique mandate in that they can pronounce themselves on very sensitive issues, but then it's also important to consider how they bring about this information, how they present it. And there are 2 routes. The first is the chairperson of the Panel of the Wise can report directly to the Peace and Security Council, who in turn report directly to the Assembly of Heads of State and Government. However, also thus far untapped, the chairperson of the Panel of the Wise can present directly or report directly to the Assembly of Heads of State and Government. That is the collective 55 African leaders that make up the African Union. The AU Commission, Itonde earlier said that you need an effective secretariat, and the AU Commission tries to be an effective secretariat to the Panel of the Wise through the Mediation and Dialogue Division. And it does this so by providing administrative, technical, and operational support during deployments and missions, by gathering the necessary information and socioeconomic and political developments that would enable the panel to take the appropriate course of action, and also by processing and production of documents and reports that can be submitted to the chairperson of the commission or the Assembly of Heads of State and Government. So before I proceed to in terms of how the Panel of the Wise has shifted in order to address current contexts better, it's good to see that a few years after the Panel of the Wise was first appointed, the continent and the world in general confronted new challenges, and we see it in the Arab Spring, the need for the population to be included in decision making. We see the number of conflicts increasing dramatically due to intercommunal violence and violent extremism and terrorism. So the old way of doing things in terms of where, as another speaker has said it earlier, where things are settled at the highest levels was no longer possible. And in order to be relevant, a change in tactic was required. And in this regard, three major points were highlighted in a way through internal deliberations of the panel, and that is to enhance their relationship with the early warning mechanisms available at the African Union. Here it is the continental early warning system. So because for early response, it requires early warning. Second was that there is a need to enhance the linkages between national, sub-regional, and the continental organization. Not only does it allow more inclusivity, but it also the average citizen to own the various processes being deployed by the continental organization. The third is that although Itonde talked about subsidiarity, and we have a guiding framework that we use to work with our sub-regional organizations, whom we call the regional economic communities, in that although the AU has the mandate to lead the peace and security process across the continent, it does so in cooperation and in complementarity with the sub-regional organizations and leveraging each other's comparative advantages. So this brings us to how the panel of the wise shifted. And in 2013, the Pan-African Network of the Wise was established. This brings together the panel of the wise, similar mechanisms at the sub-regional level. Here we can see the ECOWAS Council of the Wise, the COMESA Committee of Elders, the SADC, which operates in the Southern Africa region, and the IGAD Mediation Reference Group. And then we can see here at the tier 2 level, a plethora of national stakeholders, civil society organizations, religious leaders, traditional leaders, ombudsmen, and think tanks. Now, this is important because it is saying that and recognizing that many of the members of the panel of the wise operate at the track 1 level. They tend to be former state persons, as described earlier. Therefore, the link that is necessary with national actors is missing. There is none of that, oh, this person represents my interest or who I am. And that's why you see that panel of the wise expanding its reach first to the sub-regional level at the REX, and then to the national level to CSOs and religious leaders and traditional leaders. The kinks need to be worked out. The modalities need to be more streamlined. The capacity from the Secretariat is not 100% there to coordinate all these various arms of the panel of the wise, but at least the commitment is there. The second mechanism that was established in 2017 is FemWise Africa. And really, like, what has given birth to FemWise Africa is the Pan-African Network of the Wise. Since their establishment in 2013, they've been having numerous discussions every year in terms of how to do preventive diplomacy better. And one of the things was that the inclusivity aspect of it was missing. Women, although impacted heavily by conflict, have not been included in terms of the response aspect of it, or their voices have not been included. And in order to rectify this, FemWise Africa, which is a network of African women in conflict prevention and mediation, was established. And it is also a member of the Global Alliance of Women Mediators. So FemWise Africa does reflect the traditional pool of expertise that we're talking about, in that right now it has rostered 462 members from 50 countries of the African continent, and they operate from the grassroots to the highest political levels. The Secretariat does provide capacity development initiatives in order to allow them to play a meaningful role when they are deployed in various contexts, such as when they're deployed in liaison offices that normally operate in countries that have experienced conflict or are undergoing a transition, or in election-related processes where the panel seems to have found its niche. And here I would like to bring up recent experiences in Kenya, where a member of the panel of the wise, along with former President Nkrumah, played a significant role in some of the shuttle diplomacy that was undertaken in the most recent Kenyan elections in August 2022. So I have some takeaways that I want to share, and I think I can stop my sharing here. And that is what makes the panel of the wise more special or more conducive to our current context, right? The issue is that when mediators are appointed or when special envoys are appointed, it tends to be in an ad hoc manner, and the ability of the Commission to form these relationships in order to have not just a one-way relationship where the Commission supports the appointed special envoy or mediator, but also in a way there's a learning, a two-way process. And the panel allows the Commission to play a role in that. It has a sustained relationship with the panel of the wise. The efforts are centralized. Not only are they active in mediation context, but they can also take part in other initiatives as they have done in the establishment of FemWise Africa. They have played a role in bringing to the fore issues that might not have been in the finger or might not have been in the radar of African Union leaders, and that is also very important. It has allowed the institution to move away from track one actors and be more inclusive in its inclusion of national and sub-regional organizations and stakeholders. But there is still an issue in terms of that the notion of the panel of the wise needs to change, and that, as Itondi mentioned earlier, it doesn't need to fit a certain demographic age group. There is a need to include that it can be, the youth can play a role, and they can be wise as well, in a way, not to sound like a cliche, but it needed to be defined by age alone. And yeah, and I think the level it has, the level of coordination it has shown with sub-regional organizations is also exemplary. So it's not perfect, the panel of the wise, but I think it's still relevant to the context we face today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very insightful and also in-depth explanation of how not only just how does the African Union has developed as well, and also developed that culture and history of conflict mediation and early detection. And I think the approach of early detection to conflict and issues have been have been well covered. So at the moment, we have finished our initial round of presentations. And now we will be moving slowly, starting to move into our Q&A section, which I will remind for attendees who are watching as well to please feel free to put in your questions and in the Q&A box. But before we start with that, I am going to use my privileges as moderator to start with a question. Starting with from early on, Dr. Rohomaki mentioned a lot about has basically opened the door talking about the introductory role, the disruptive role AI has brought in. And I think that was a very interesting area to look into, because I think for the longest time, we general understandings of peace and of reconciliation, peace building, peacekeeping has always been generally in a very traditional sense. And to be talking about the influence of disruptive technology is, I think, something we have not given enough attention to. So my question is for that, I would love for Dr. Rohomaki to expand on that, especially with the issue that the matter of technology and its level of development has not been consistent throughout the world. And sometimes we can feel these effects much harder than other parts of the world. So I'd like for invite his insights on how do you think this will play out in the future, and especially because a lot of these countries, these areas of conflict may not have this, may not be, how do I say this, would they be as greatly affected by this rate of technology?
Thanks a lot. Great question, also quite difficult one. But let me start from sort of the negative towards the positive. And I think the starting point, and I have a background also on sort of crisis management stuff. So, artificial intelligence-driven military defense and intelligence technologies, they are being developed and tested faster than we all can keep up with, and particularly with the regulators, that they can hardly keep up with the pace of things. So for instance, and this comes from sort of battlefield experiences, is that artificial intelligence, they have halved the duration that a human takes to identify a target in battle. And they have created these game tactics and schemes that are superior to what any human commander can create. we talk about swarm drone technology and killer robots and what have you. So, okay, what has this to do with peace mediation? Well, the point is that these technologies that are used for disruptive purposes being developed very fast, and they are also being used to manipulate political debates and social dynamics. I mean, I think we see this in many instances. I have also noted in the Southeast Asian region, particularly with the very difficult conflict in Myanmar, how this has affected the political debates and social dynamics in very dangerous ways. Okay. Artificial intelligence is also used and developed in cyber and hybrid warfare, and they create sort of new conflict layers. And it is very difficult and challenging for the peace mediation community to access and understand. However, and this is sort of on the more positive note, as a tool, artificial intelligence, can be useful because, first of all, they can be used for big data-driven analysis, conflict analysis, early warning, forecasting, scenario and process analysis, participatory consultations. I think Patrick already referred to that. Public sentiment research and strategic communications. And it can be used to support confidence building measures and on a very practical level, on issues on such as ceasefire monitoring and human rights monitoring and what have you. So what I'm saying is that this is a field that is in constant flux, and we sort of struggle to keep up with sort of the technology parts of it. But it is very important to sort of deconstruct and understand the whole phenomena and try to come up, and I think Patrick also referred to this, innovative approaches in how to use artificial intelligence and new technologies for constructive purposes. So that is something that I have to say, and this is something that at least on our continent in Europe we are seeing this all the time. This is also what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. But I think to answer your question, it has applicability globally to contexts that are only now starting to grapple with the issue. So I hope I at least partly answered your challenging question. And
No.
esteemed colleague can chip in here too.
Yeah. I also say to anyone as well, like amongst our panel as well, that if you do have any other points to jump in, especially on these other questions, you're more than welcome to. You can just chime in. And so when that was thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. I know this is like one of those things that only later on we'll only start seeing more as they develop because of how fast it's going and how uncertain things are at the moment. And now I'll be going through the questions that we received so far. So for the first one, which is directed to Mr. De Vries, they ask, isn't the rise of anti-pluralistic or anti-democratic political leaders, such as former President Donald Trump, a major contributor to the rise of armed conflict globally? This rise provides fuel to ultra-fundamentalist and authoritarian leaders in the region.
Yeah, good question. Before I go into that question, if I may, I just wanted to pick up on Ollie's point on artificial intelligence, just to highlight that. For example, in a conflict like Yemen, new technologies have also been used, like, for example, WhatsApp dialogues with various leaders of groups that could not take place in person, and also through other social media forms of conflict prevention dialogues, civil society engagement has increased. So that element of technology in conflict resolution is very important. I don't know if we should go in this discussion into whether certain persons have contributed to global rivalries leading to more conflict. But what we can, of course, see in that wider context, that over the past years, as I have alluded to, you see these geopolitical debates. And actually, for example, one element why conflict resolution is also much more difficult is that because of these rivalries, you see a sort of paralysis in the UN Security Council among the P5 to actually take decisions on conflict resolution and conflict prevention. So that rivalry plays out in regions like we see now in Ukraine, but also at that level of the UN that cannot play the role it played in the past in bringing parties together. I don't think we can only attribute this to Donald Trump. It is a wider trend. Also, if we look now at the recent developments in China, the question is how conflict resolution and new models, and especially also in an informal setting, now that we see that diplomacy doesn't always lead to results, how new models can contribute to change these perspectives and mindsets into a more benign discussion. I would like to leave it there. I would like to say something more about best practices and expertise of experiences in Europe on working with rosters, but I can do that later. Thank you.
That works too. And for for this question, I'm going to go a little bit left field. So aside from just our panelists, we do have the ASEAN IPR Secretariat with us. And this is a question that we'd like to direct for him, which is the fact that being a consultative body, how will the ASEAN, like the proposed idea of the ASEAN Panel of the Wise, function in conjunction to existing ASEAN-led mechanisms, such as the ARF? Because considering it plays such an important role in promoting preventative diplomacy and confidence-building measures for conflict resolution.
Well, thank you for this certainly very pertinent question, but certainly this will be, the scope will be beyond ASEAN. First, indeed, what we are actually trying to discuss here to form the panel of the wise within the scope of ASEAN. Of course, ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, is a much wider and bigger forum, consists of 27 members. Within those 27 members also include countries from Western Hemisphere to Australia, even European Union is there, the superpower, US, China, Russia, also there. So very wide spectrum of membership of the ASEAN Regional Forum. Indeed, the panel of the wise that the ASEAN for Peace and Reconciliation intend to establish, first, indeed, within the scope of ASEAN countries, the regions, of the Southeast Asia. First, indeed, this will be later on, if it is agreeable, determined by the 10 members of ASEAN, whether the scope, the mandate, and responsibility to be determined by the 10 member countries, if they agree to have this panel of the wise in the future. So later on, let's see how this panel of the wise to be operationals. Because if you look at the objective of the ASEAN Regional Forum, first, to foster constructive dialogue and consultation on political and security issues of common interest and concern. Secondly, to make significant contributions to efforts towards confidence building and preventive diplomacy in Asia-Pacific region. That's the ARF objective. I don't know in the development later on, once the panel of the wise to be established, whether this scope will be also reaching out the wider area. We don't know yet, but now what we are focusing is the panel of the wise within our regions, Southeast Asia. So that's my response. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the elaboration. And since we're kind of on this topic, discussing especially about the feasibility of applying this sort of model in ASEAN, there is a question that I think we should, well, let's open this up to everyone on this panel to ask. To what extent do you think can ASEAN as an institution adopt the conflict mediation strategies shared in the discussion, considering that there's still a very strong adherence to the principles of non-interference in the region? I think we can probably start with either Mr. Itonde or was it Ms. Alemu for their insights?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Let me say, I mean, this is a critical question being raised and not solely applicable to the ASEAN region. Ultimately, for me, it's about not only mandate and principles, but trust. Do the respective parties, member states, see the type of role that these mechanisms, particularly the panel of wise, can be in the service of those of concern? And with or without the legalities or principles, it will rest upon trust. The African Union has experienced this on a number of occasions with a very strong, clear mandate at times. But even if not explicit, there is an instinct towards a principle of non-interference. In the same breath, however, there is an increasing awareness of the need to more so rely upon regional means of resolving differences, be it in the form of political or violent conflicts. It also extends to the humanitarian sphere, in which I squarely work at the moment. So I think ultimately it is for those regional institutions, and I speak from the perspective of the African continent, at least in terms of experience, to demonstrate the professionalism and expertise that is to the benefit of the respective member states and ultimately those communities that are directly impacted. That is a way of mitigating around some of the principles and legalities that may prevent support. And here, I think it's important that we speak about accompaniment rather than intervention, because ultimately we know that sustainable solutions rest upon the ownership of national actors, communities in the most inclusive manner. So accompaniment, I think, and this is also tied to then the spirit, if I understand Ambassador Hoja's description and your earlier introduction of how the panel of the wise comes into effect in the context of ASEAN, is really bringing that wise counsel from an accompaniment perspective rather than a heavy-handed classical intervention perspective, which again may mitigate some of those perceptions in principle, in law, or in fact. Thank you.
If I may come in right here, right after Itonde, I think if we look at how long it took for the OAU to shift into a conversation where Africa leaders were saying, okay, the past has not worked, that our methods have not worked, how can we improve our methods in order to respond to conflicts better? And that is all about timing. It took, I don't think there was ever an institution as such as the OAU member states who are very focused on the issue of non-interference and about sovereignty. And this is due to the history of the African continent, given the past era of colonization, and also the Cold War, where proxy wars led to the death of hundreds of thousands of citizens. And then in the eventual detachment of many Western nations following the conclusion of the Cold War, leaving the OAU to handle some of its peace and security challenges by itself. So timing is important, and the recognition that perhaps it is pivotal to shift from non-interference to interference on particular cases, maintaining the principle of sovereignty, of course. But also, aside from trust, I would say confidence is important from member states in terms of how they perceive their regional organizations. If it is seen as perhaps maybe this might be the wrong way, but if it's seen as the brainchild or an instrument to advance the national interest of a single or two other nations rather than the collective, the trust will not be there. So trust and confidence in that the institution is established for the collective advancement rather than for the one or two. And then, of course, we cannot discount the role of visionary leadership. The OAU would not have transitioned into the African Union without some of the visionary leadership of Thabo Mbeki and Olusegun Obasanjo, and even Muammar Gaddafi. Like, no matter what their reputation might have been or is, they have played a significant role in mobilizing the African leadership towards this common vision of a united Africa that also takes into primacy the lives of its African citizens rather than just the leadership. Thank you.
I'm happy to come in, and unless Oli,
Yes.
you want to go first, or? Yeah, looking at the type of role a panel of wise pool of experts can function. Of course, principles are very important, but we also need to be, I think, pragmatic here. And there's sort of, I think, 5 elements or lessons learned one can take into account, but 5 elements that would need to be considered in sort of defining, identifying what kind of role you want to play with a panel of wise pool of experts. First of all, it's sort of a strategic framework. Is it the whole process? And I think Oli referred to the EU comprehensive approach. Do you focus only on conflict prevention or also on reconciliation, on implementation of agreements, on peace building, and even later on development and economic incentives? So that sort of scope in which of the phases of a process would you focus on, or the entire in a sort of comprehensive approach, I think is one element. The second one is sort of the mapping. you work only top down, so which is more at the political level of conflict resolution, or also bottom up. We see increasingly in conflicts across the world more local agreements that influence sort of the social setting in a wider conflict setting, impacting also the top-down structures. Thirdly, of course, the geographic scope. The EU chose to not only work, let's say, in sort of neighboring or regions close to Europe, but more globally with conflict prevention and EU missions. So that is also a strategic choice. And related to this is the expertise. How sort of broad would you want to set up your pool of experts? Does it include rule of law, police, security, capacity building in governance, or is it a much more limited, purely at mediation focused element? And lastly, what we experience, how do you deal and could you potentially play a role in the coordination also of mediation organizations? What you often see is also sort of a competition between a wide range of mediation organization operating next to or in consultation with EU or UN or other regional organizations. But often there is also a competition or overlap between these organizations in a conflict prevention or conflict resolution setting. So that's another element that can affect the output of a pool of experts or panel of wise. Yeah, so I wanted to sort of highlight these elements in defining role in addition to principles. Over to you.
Can I just make a comment on this? Absolutely fantastic conversation we're having here. Sort of trying to formulate as I speak. I was very impressed with Ms. Alamu's presentation on the structures of the African Union, Panel of the Wise and FemWise and Youth-Wise. And my point actually ties into something that I think Mr. Guy Banim mentions in the chat, is that we are seeing, I think, less and less sort of these track one official state-to-state processes unfolding. Rather, we are seeing more of these 1.5 or track 1.5 or track 2 or even track 3 processes. And this links to what Patrick mentioned about local deals and such. So I was also wondering, how does this sort of, going back to the African Union debate, the very formal Panel of the Wise set up, how does it link with the work, the very, very important work that FemWise and Youth-Wise are doing and bringing sort of the different kind of voices, and something that Itonde, I think, mentioned, the sort of generational shifts that we need to factor into the peace processes. So maybe Ms. Alamu, if you can, and others, of course, comment on that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. I think we have to go back to the mandate of the Panel of the Wise in terms of how it was provided for it by the Assembly of Heads of State and Government. Usually it's very rare that African leaders would listen to, during their extraordinary summits or ordinary summits, that they would open up the platform for other actors to come in and share their experiences on specific contexts. Now, the situation of FemWise Africa and Wise Youth and the PanWise network under the Panel of the Wise provides it with almost a direct channel to African leaders to discuss, to bring to the fore some of their concerns. This is not to say that it has been done well, but this is to say there's an opportunity there that has not been tapped completely. And that is citizens, civil society actors can bring their concerns to African leaders through the panel of the wise. The other aspect is that the panel, being a member of the panel of the wise, opens up doors to make impact in various conflict situations. And I just mentioned the one about the Kenyan elections, and also it was similar to the Zambian elections that took place last year. There is now an effort at the AU to ensure that members of FemWise and members of Wise Youth are included in some of these initiatives of the panel of the wise, to bring them along, and not only to have a one-directional coaching sort of arrangement, but to allow the youth and women groups to share their experiences and make an impact in some of these interactions that are taking place. It's still a long way ahead. There's a lot of work to be done, a lot of advocacy even from the commission itself in order to ensure that when the panel goes through the door, that they bring along these actors with them, but there is hope. So this is how the panel of the wise can bring about the participation of both FemWise African members and Wise Youth along with it. Thank you.
Thanks. And just I'm going to segue quite quickly. The question that Dr. Rohamaki has actually referred to, I would also like to direct this towards Mr. Kakoma as well, actually. The question was actually, do you have data or evidence on the impact of mechanisms such as the African Union Panel of the Wise or the UN Standby Team or the EU roster? It would be interesting to be able to quantify how much input, how she put likely for an effective output. And as you have implied in your presentation earlier, that we should be expecting a lot of redundancy in the system, especially because with such a large amount of wise people and such mechanisms with very few engagements on top level track one processes.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and to the participant for the question. Perhaps a particular reading of my intervention. I did not imply redundancy in that sense, but more so that the particularity, as we heard in the presentation of the panel of the wise, and the specific individuals allows maybe for more tailored deployments. Whereas rosters, if they are in the hundreds, and we saw numbers, for example, over 400, and I've seen some over 1,000, by their very nature, create limitations in terms of deployments. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, and I wouldn't call it redundant. It provides, again, as indicated, an affirmation of that individual's skill set in their particular context, as we could say inside mediators or facilitators. It gives further credibility and affirmation. It also contributes to the creation of a community of practice. So we don't need to be squarely focused on deployments, and the lack thereof is redundant, but rather this community who can meet on occasion, exchange experience, ideas for the benefit of their respective locations. Now, having said that, I think we need to be mindful that any mechanism is only, I keep coming back to this term, we can describe it and define it in many words, many ways. Nessenet mentioned confidence, I think is a further definition of the same. But we can have as many mechanisms, as many experts as we want. But if there is a lack of trust from the respective parties, that's the redundancy that comes about, right? And so there is where the individuals matter, the relationships matter, the track record matters. And why I mention this is because we know of numerous experiences whereby formally mandated processes have not been the means by which conflicts are resolved or mitigated, but other more quiet diplomacy. Much of what we've heard in the descriptions of particular member states of the AU electoral process is quiet diplomacy. it's behind the scenes. It's not in the formal spaces. And unfortunately, I'm not sure how much data there is on it precisely because it is quiet by design and deliberate. And quiet also, again, linked back to the repetitive word of trust, creating those environments where parties feel as though they can truly work out their problems in a manner that is meaningful and reflective of their respective interests for the long term. So again, we should think about this not solely from the lens of deployment, but also from the lens of precisely gathering that richness of experience and creating that community of practice. The Asian region has an enormous amount of experience and wisdom to share within and comparatively. So I believe this kind of mechanism also contributes to the enhancement of knowledge more broadly, and ideally towards the prevention and resolution of conflicts as well. Thank you. Thank
you very much for that elaboration. And we have this question now. We're directing it to Dr. Rohamaki. They've made reference to international humanitarian law aims to regulate the harm to civilian population and reduce unnecessary suffering to combatants during war. So the use of AI during war poses many queries in the mind of researchers as to what will happen in case criminal liability arises due to the act of AI. Who will be so it would ask, who would be responsible for such an act? Who will bear individual criminal responsibility? So would that be the inventor, the programmer, the military commander, or so on? How would IHL be applicable in modern warfare when autonomous weapon systems will be used during war?
Wow, wow, that was really a tough one. I'm not a lawyer, so going on a limb here, but I think the sort of research and debate around the use of automated weapon systems and the like, the point in the final analysis is that someone either programs the weapon or makes the final decision to deploy it. So it's not like, after all, it's just a tool. It's a big tool, but it's like to use a very almost a banal example. It's like a hammer. Somebody uses the hammer for a certain end. So then you have to trace the weapon system to the deployer. So I don't think it's so much the of course the tech companies are involved. They provide the platforms for that, but they are, after all, at least in a military combat, you have commanders who make the decisions what kind of weapon systems are used for what purposes. So there is an individual always behind the system, and ultimately is responsible for those actions. But I think in terms of IHL, it's a work in progress. So like I said earlier, these kinds of AI systems, they are always, ahead of the legal frameworks and practitioners and so forth. I hope I sort of answered a very difficult question. Thanks.
Yeah, it is definitely loaded. Okay, so I think, yes, please, Mr.
No, just to say that in my current capacity, I work with International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and I'm associated with the Geneva Academy for International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights Law. And I would refer the participant to the custodian of the Geneva Conventions, the International Committee of the Red Cross, position on autonomous weapon systems, at least of which was published last May of 2021, where it points to unpredictability and limits, if you will, on the impact on civilian populations as one of the concerns around it in relationship to IHL. But I would refer to that position, which is an evolving position as the technologies also evolve. Thank you, Madam Maria.
Yeah, sorry about that. Just settling a few things. Yeah, so this will be actually our final question, and it's directed to Miss Alemu. They hold on, it disappeared. Okay. The person asking, thanks you for your insightful presentation. Can you elaborate a little more on the Wise Youth network, and especially on how they operate and how they contribute to the PanWise mandates?
Thanks, Lisa. I think the question disappeared because I was typing.
Oh, okay, that's right. No worries, no worries. That's what happened. Okay, because I thought there was something going on my end. But yeah, thank you very much for covering that. All right. So actually, at the moment, we have come to the end actually because we've wrapped up our Q&A already and finished up surprisingly quite well at a good pace. So from all the sessions, I'm just going to do a really quick wrap up. Hopefully, if I can do justice to all these presentations today. We've seen that from these presentations, we've seen a lot of key points that we should be taking on to, especially when now in approaching and understanding all of the experiences and all of the sort of knowledge that we are gaining, especially in dealing with conflict. I think in our first presentation, we've seen how the importance of embodying the importance of conflict mediation and peaceful resolution can be further sustained through not only just the political with the government initiative, but the importance of incorporating as much of as all the relevant stakeholders possible, because it's no longer just, as mentioned by many of our speakers, it's not just track one anymore. We have to be thinking about non-government, civil society, grassroots levels, and how can they overall contribute to not only cultivating a culture, but also embodying a practice that we can not only share with other neighbors, like regional neighbors or partners, but also, and how can we export that, if you will, and also highlighting the importance of disruptive elements. So for this case, it was mostly technology and AI as well that was covered. So I think, and emphasizes that what we see nowadays, that to always keep ahead, not to say keep ahead, but be aware that these disruptions can happen, and what is the best way to mitigate its effects when we start seeing, even before we start seeing its effects. In our second presentation, we've seen that there's also it's not issues. We recognize the importance to define and conceptualize peace and what we expect out of it. Very similarly to incorporate to the previous point, that it needs to be holistic, of those to be included. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be considered of what sort of output they want to, how they were to be perceived, and also understanding that there to recognize the importance and value of pragmatism, because sometimes we should, I'm not saying we shouldn't aim too high, but be able to meet goals that we can see, and not just aspirations that we repeat time and time again. And in our third presentation, I think this is also a very interesting point in saying that aside from the structural elements of it, Mr. Kakoma highlighted the more human and communal element, which I thought was really interesting. And not just saying in the collective sense, but mentioning how the important elements of trust, how they are perceived, how do we use these sort of elements to strengthen cooperative activities and cooperative programs to further these goals of conflict resolution and peace, and maintaining peace in whichever respective regions we may come from. And also the importance, and also introducing the concept of not just intervention, but the role of accompaniment, which I think is also quite interesting, because we've seen time and time again how the importance of language and perception can really affect the receptiveness of these sort of activities and collaborative efforts to in the eyes of those receiving them. And so our final in-depth presentation by Ms. Alemu is showing us a really in-depth in the time given to us. The case study of how history, local contexts can really build, show how can they build specific practices, views, and cultures of particular organizations. And it shows that how timing especially is of the essence and a key factor, because we recognize that none of these things can grow in the short term. These are long-term efforts that sometimes, yes, we may not see the outcome immediately, but if the political will does exist, we can see these foundations really strengthen and built towards something that the people involved can be confident in and can trust in, especially when guided by the leaders that can really drive this home. And with that, I will hand over to Kartika. Thank you.
Can I say something still, or are we running out of time?
I think we still have a few more minutes.
Yeah, we can do that.
Give closing statements to the speakers. I apologize for jumping in, Ms. Isa.
No worries, it's all good.
Just one minute for each speaker. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, then what I wanted to say, I'll use the closing statement for this. No, I was triggered in the discussion by Ollie referring to AI, and I think Itonde sort of highlighted also the importance of anthropology and history in terms of expertise, and I highlighted the role of psychology and emotions, but also business and economics. So that is very multi-dimensional, whereas what I see is often a very one-dimensional approach, which is purely political in conflict resolution. It is, okay, we need a new constitution to share power, and that will then solve the issue. Whereas with the points also the other speakers made, these conflicts are usually much more dimensional, and that requires a multidisciplinary approach or teams that you would want to establish and look at this conflict from many more angles than purely the political. Wanted to highlight that. Thank you so much.
No worries. I've bin told, Mr. Itonde, you have something to say as well?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you again to the ASEAN IPR for convening this and for the invitation. You spoke in your summary of disruptions, and we focused particularly today on the disruptive aspect of new forms of technology. I would say that as next week initiates the next COP 27, the Conference of Parties hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh on climate, it's important that we also put into this context the disruptive nature, not only in terms of technology, but environmentally, with extreme, unpredictable, severe consequences that lead to displacements, that lead to, in fact, the possible challenges for smaller island states, many of which are within the region of concern today. The African continent is experiencing severe forms, and we know that at COP27, featuring as an Africa COP, as already expressed by the Egyptian presidency, the question of how climate change and the related disruptions in the environment link back to overall stability as it pertains to conflict. So as we think about the establishment of such mechanisms, I think squarely on the disruptive agenda, of course, includes the notion of climate. And therein, we must think about this also from a mediation perspective in terms of taking advantage of new forms of technology that enable us to anticipate and, where possible, prevent the impact on communities so that the disruption does not lead to other forms of social upheaval beyond the environmental. So putting that squarely on the table as we move towards COP, and again, a word of deep appreciation to you, moderator, distinguished colleagues, and to Ambassador Pooja and colleagues at IPR. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll formally hand this back to our MC, Ms. Kartika.
Thank you very much, Ms. Iza Ibrahim, for moderating this afternoon's discussion. Thank you as well to our distinguished speakers for their time, for their presentation, and their passionate way of answering all the questions that's been posed by our participants, our audience this afternoon. Some of them are difficult, but also some of them are very important for the ASEAN IPR to know as well, because as I earlier mentioned, setting up a possible ASEAN panel of the wise is one of the plans that we have under our 3-year work plan, and one of the operations that we try to actualize one of our functions actually. Now, just to close, right now on the chat box, I know that this is something the participants have been asking about. We have shared the link for the e-certificate. If you have any difficulties in opening the link, please send us an email as mentioned in the chat box. And thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in to this afternoon's discussion. Hopefully you can join us for our last session of the year, which will be around November or December. And overall, thank you very much for your time, for your participation, for your attention for the past 2 hours. And thank you. Good afternoon. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Atonde.
Thank you.